At age 12, most kids are looking forward to being 16, to being 18, to being 20. They don't want to be children anymore, and they want to reach those milestone numbers that seem to finally be good for something. When I was 12, I wanted to be 16. I wanted to be able to drive a car and to be a little more independent. But at the same time, I was terrified of turning 18. I was terrified for the same reason that most people are terrified at age 12 and at any age. I was afraid of dying. Now, I wasn't afraid of dying for any reason. I just didn't think I would die at 18 randomly. Rather, my mother told me the story of my grandfather's life. She told me about the kind of man he was and how she was raised. And she told me how in 1966, my grandfather was drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. He received a letter in the mail that said he'd been drafted. My grandmother was devastated. Her husband, of barely 2 years, was being drafted to fight in a war where 11,000 American soldiers had died just the year before. A war where 20,000 soldiers had died since the beginning of the course of the conflict. And a war which an eventual 58,000 American soldiers would die. Luckily for my grandparents, and for me, my grandmother became pregnant with my mother, their first daughter, and he was able to get out of the draft and raise their family. But how did we get to this point where American men, young American men with a median age of 20, were forced away from their friends, their families, and their futures to be drafted in war? And how did we transition from this draft to the all-volunteer fighting force that you see today? The story begins in 1940 with the first peacetime draft in the United States history. Many of these men would go on to fight in World War II, and almost 2/3 would be draftees. The draft would go on after this for another 7 years till 1947, past the end of World War II, be stalled for 15 months, and then reinstated for another 25 years in order to adequately fulfill the needs for the coming Cold War. To the coming Cold War, America had become a nation that transitioned away from its isolationist tendencies into interventionist tendencies. As America became more and more involved in conflict, it was finally required that American men would be drafted for the first time since the American Civil War. But quickly, Americans became disillusioned with the Vietnam War, seeing the military as a problem, seeing the war itself as a problem, and seeing the draft as a problem. Quickly, with opposition mounting, in 1973, when America pulled out of the Vietnam War, the draft ended. This happened because of cost, because of the substantial loss of future of young men, and because of opposition to the draft itself. In 1970, the Gates Commission stated that America would fundamentally benefit from an all-volunteer fighting force. This is for 3 reasons. First, the all-volunteer fighting force would be more diverse in age, be more diverse in gender and in race, and have a higher quality of education. The all-volunteer fighting force would have constituents that finally wanted to be involved in war and would therefore be more interested in staying in war and being held to a higher standard. Anytime that I think about, or The United States Army effectively transitioned to an all-volunteer fighting force by 1973 and has been that way ever since. With higher benefits and pay for American soldiers, it is more likely that they will join the military and stay in it. The American military proved that it is possible to fight and consistently win wars with an all-volunteer fighting force. Any time that I think about my grandfather and the pregnancy that saved his life, I look to the men that volunteered to take his place, and I look to the men that volunteered to take mine, and I thank them every day. Thank you very much.